I also think that there's a huge part of her identity was formed in the war. She fell in love with Philip. She was absolutely potty about him from a very early age. I was very struck by that, again, in the memoirs and diaries.
Hello and welcome to this bonus episode of the Aspects of History podcast. My name is Oliver Webb-Carter and I'm the editor and your host. And as I promised on Saturday, Dr Tessa Dunlop has joined me to discuss the Queen's death and the media's response to it. We also discuss the Queen's wartime service and her early relationship with Prince Philip. Tessa has been very busy, and so I just want to thank her for giving me the time. It's interesting to get her perspective on this event, and if you want to find out more, I've put links to Tessa's books and other podcasts that she's appeared on. If you can subscribe, that would be fantastic, and if you like the pod, please give a review on Apple Podcasts. Google doesn't let you, I don't think, but Spotify operates a star system out of 5, so don't be shy. I'll now hand you over to Dr. Tessa Dunlop. Tessa Dunlop, welcome back to the Aspects of History podcast. And it's so kind of you because you've been on Sky News, Channel 4 News, Talk TV, and now you can add my humble podcast to that list.
I've been on a bigger podcast than yours, Ollie. How does that make you feel?
Well, is it bigger?
Yeah, newscast. It's the BBC one.
Oh,
actually, on that day, it really was it's the fourth day in or something, and I had really no sleep, and I got someone to line everything up for me. Literally, I've now become a diva, and so I just went from one Zoom link to another, and suddenly I was like down the line with Jim Knockerty, and I got sort of weirdly competitive. I thought, well, bugger me, he's not a historian. I sort of out historied him to the point that the producer sent me a text in the middle, and he said, "This is meant to be actually a news program, not a history lesson." I was like,
well done. Well, you'll be, if you're a diva, you'll be on Meghan Markle's podcast next.
Yeah, maybe I should wait for that. Yeah, I'm going to wait for my invitation. I'm actually kinder about Meghan than many people are, especially whenever I go into the Mail, because as we know, the Mail and Meghan don't have a particularly kind history. No. I don't think kind is a word that comes into that relationship. Anyway, we're going to talk about the late Queen. Let's talk just very briefly, if we may, about the coverage. What's really interesting about the sort of popularity of modern monarchy, Britain's monarchy, is that it's a bit of a construct. It's a sort of an invented tradition, one very deliberately done at the turn of the 20th century, when there was sort of imperial argy-bargy going on between the European thrones. And one of the ways in which you inculcate or make big, aggrandize a royal house is partly through paraphernalia and ceremony and pomp. And we got all that kind of on track, particularly by the end of Victoria's reign, the Diamond and the Golden Jubilees, and then her funeral. Even though she was like the widow of Windsor, she hated coming out on show. But what's interesting is the oxygen for this new popular, powerless monarchy is the press. You need a very supportive, right-leaning press to transport the message, to mobilize the masses. And we're seeing that very much. And I am a facilitator of that press game, I recognize. We see that very much at the moment. And I'm kind of struck, and I'm aware that there's quite a few days to go, over a week to go before the state funeral. And I wonder to what extent the press is going to keep up this blanket coverage, and to what effect. You'll remember with Philip's funeral, there was a bit of a backlash. He obviously wasn't the monarch. He was a supporting role. But there was a bit, people sort of complained, and the BBC put up a sort of, you could post complaints on their webpage. And I do worry, obviously the Queen isn't there to moderate any longer. I don't think there's any harm in having the cortege or the coffin lying in state and then going to another news story.
Well, I think that's right. I think when there's something to transmit, like the proclamation yesterday, that's obviously an event that hasn't been seen on TV before.
But that's different, isn't it? That's Yeah, and at the moment I can understand why it's been more or less blanket coverage, because we've had the proclamation and the death and obviously the Queen on the move now from Balmoral. But I support all that. And I'm a monarchist, and insofar as I think the institution of monarchy works very well for the British Constitution. But I think that 10 days is quite a long time.
Indeed, we've got more than a week now until the funeral.
Yeah.
How do you fully?
So it'd be interesting. It'd be interesting to see how the press are going to handle the next week. Obviously, there'll be another build-up for the funeral, but I wonder in the interim what the tone will be. Obviously, we've got Prince Charles, quite rightly, going to all four corners of the
King Charles.
British Union. King Charles. Oh, I just said Prince Charles. Yeah, it's because I'm tired. Lucky I didn't do that on the Jim Noggerty newscast, eh? And King Charles. What was I going to say about King Charles? Yeah, he's going to. And do you know, Liz Truss has jumped on his coattails. She's going with him.
Yes, I'm surprised at that.
Well, do you think he felt he couldn't say no?
Oh, it was a request from the Prime Minister, was it?
Yeah, well, it's not stipulated. There's no procedure that says the Prime Minister should accompany. But the Prime Minister being there immediately makes it political. And the whole point is the monarchy's above politics. If I'd been Prince Charles, I'd have said, get on out, girlfriend. This is my gig, not yours. I've been waiting for this gig for 73 years. I'd have given her the old heave-ho. But they're probably sticking to each other like glue because they're both newbies, aren't they?
Yeah. That must be it. I mean, you're right. It does make a political statement that
it does, yeah, especially in places like Scotland that didn't even vote the Tory MP, a Tory Prime Minister, and Wales and Northern. I mean, it's a much far more toxic brand, Liz Truss, in those three nations than she is in England.
Well, we'll see how that goes down, because I think that's only just been announced this morning. We're speaking on the 11th.
Yes, I think you should sit slightly further back from your microphone, just slightly. Just thought I'd give you a bit of a tip there for your own podcast. There we go. Good. Now we can move on to the Queen. We're going to do a quick 10-minute podcast on this. Sorry, I've now waffled on at great length about other things. And then we're going to return to the subject of Elizabeth in her early years later on in November, aren't we, Ollie?
Yes, I've effectively given you control of this podcast, as my listeners would have just heard.
Yeah, good. So let's just recap. I talked to you last for a Jubilee edition with regard to Her Majesty's service in the ATS, the Auxiliary Territorial Service in World War II. I should just point out here that I did a Radio 4 documentary about this. It went out a few days ago. I'm not using your platform to advertise other platforms. Obviously, I'd never dream of doing that.
I will put a link in the show notes. Don't you worry.
Yeah, you do that with some of the original women from the ATS. And Betty rang me yesterday. She's 99. She went, Tessa, everyone says the Queen's like a grandmother. She said, she's actually younger than me, like this. And I've never been a grandmother, said Betty. So funny. We forget, because the Queen was so old, obviously, that she came in many forms and packages, for Betty and for Daphne and for Barbara in the ATS. She was actually their junior, Anyway, just a quick note on her. Since I wrote Army Girls, actually, I came across the Windsor Diaries, written by a sort of an aristocratic girl, Althea, who, because she was a girl, failed to inherit a dukedom, and therefore sort of was sidelined and spent most of the war in Windsor Park, and became really the sole playmate of the two princesses, although she was sort of slightly dubious, 3 years older than Elizabeth and 7 older than Margaret. But she wrote these wonderfully candid diaries that were published in 2020. And they've been very useful for my subsequent research. But she's hysterical because she's obviously a classic posh girl, totally aristocratic, doesn't really like it when Princess Elizabeth does a pantomime with the local children on Windsor Estate, doesn't sort of like the backslapping and the handling of the commoners, really thinks it's most unbecoming, totally misses the point of modern monarchy and the kind of bond between the people and the princess. And her other horror is when and Elizabeth joins the ATS, because of course it's, the Auxiliary Tart Service. It's the sort of demeaned, much lower, it has much lower standing than the other two female services. She's in the VAD, being a true posh girl, of course. And Elizabeth gets into this ATS uniform, which Althea thinks is absolutely hideous and unbecoming, and doesn't like the way Elizabeth's hair's curled, and anyway thinks the princess has terrible dress sense and looks a bit chubby, and really speaks her mind. Sometimes she thinks she looks puffy, and oh dear, I wish she did more wide reading, and like it's at the same time as desperately trying to ingratiate herself into the royal family and into the princess's circle, and she never quite manages it. It's really interesting. It's a great insight into into the late Queen's kind of early ability to acknowledge people and remain on good terms with them without letting them be too close. There's only one conversation despite all of Althea's attempts, and despite the fact she was this older girl, there's only one moment where Elizabeth is slightly indiscreet and says, "Oh, I'm a bit worried, I've got to find a husband," and stuff, and kind of, reveals her hand. Otherwise, there's this kind of, you can tell she's got early on, she's aware of her inheritance, aware of her special status. Anyway, off she goes to be this, eventually becomes this woman in service, which of course Althea thinks is terribly common, and so does the king. The king doesn't really approve of women in service, but what can you do if there's been a sea change in thinking since the beginning of the war, 1941? Of course, we've talked about this, Ollie. 1941 being the first time ever Britain introduced conscription for women, and that age lowered. So it starts age 20 and then it lowers to 19. And of course, they're desperately trying to recruit girls even younger than that, but you need parental permission from 17 and a half. And the Queen, or princess as she was then, who's locked down in Windsor with Althea and Margaret and her governess, Crawfie, really quite bored and obviously champing at the bit to have a go, is eventually allowed to sign up. There's a huge amount of paperwork between the palace, Buckingham Palace, the Queen Mother, Queen as she was then, Queen Elizabeth, and the ATS, sort of all the paraphernalia and the box ticking. It does make you think about today and the organisation of the funeral and so forth, just how much bureaucracy is going on, sort of frantic, elbow grease required for any kind of procedural event to take place. And that's what the princess's role in the ATS was. It was ceremonial more than anything else.
But even looking at the proclamation yesterday, which was hugely bureaucratic, really, when you listen to what they were running through. So moving forward to
and by the way, it's just a big day off, a big paid day off for politicians, wasn't it, really? I just looked at them all.
Parliament's been suspended, I believe. And
I know. Well, they're just raking him for doing nothing. I'm sorry, I've got nothing in all grist to King Charles, who's now having to properly work, age 73 and a half. That must be quite a shock to the system. I mean, he's not a spring chicken. Most people are sliding into a gentle retirement at 73 and a half, over a nice glass of vino and probably a copy of the Telegraph. I think that's probably his paper of choice, although he is a big environmentalist.
Are you sure about that?
Well, exactly. I've just changed my mind because he's an environmentalist, isn't he? So I wonder what he does read. I know that the Queen liked the Telegraph. It was one of the papers they took, and Prince Philip broadened it out and included the Mirror and the Sunday Pictorial, which no longer exists, but was quite lefty and controversial.
Well, the Telegraph has got very good cricket coverage.
Or does King Charles, does he like cricket?
The Duke of Edinburgh loved cricket.
Right. Well, the Duke of Edinburgh would have gone for the Telegraph for sport. I'm not saying the Duke of Edinburgh didn't read the more right-wing press, but the papers that Buckingham Palace took, the base of them, it was a broader church, thanks to Philip. But I don't know about Charles, but he is, he was the man who originally talked to plants when no one else realized that plants had a voice. So he's kind of a pioneer in that way. Anyway, going back to Princess Elizabeth, because you're only getting 10 minutes because I've moved on.
Well, you've gone over.
Harder and bigger
you've given me additional minutes, so that's very kind of you. I think we should move. The
additional minutes for your Patreon clients. Do you have Patreon clients yet, or are you not successful?
No,
enough?
we don't limit our content to our customers, because this is the way of connecting authors with listeners, and so we don't want to limit.
Move further away from the microphone.
Limit the number there. Thank you for that more advice.
Okay.
And so I've mentioned the Duke of Edinburgh. This is your next book, which I know you're revising at the moment because you'd finished it the other day. I haven't
though, because I've been too busy doing teletarting, haven't I? I've got to, basically it was in with the copy editor, Philip and Elizabeth, the early years, story of young love and marriage, etc. And the Queen died just as it had gone to the copy editors, and now I've got it back and I've got to top and tail it differently and change the tense, and I haven't touched it because I'm too tired. And grammar, what do they say? Write drunk, edit sober.
I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, so, and I always think when you're really tired, it's a bit like being a bit drunk, isn't it? You're a bit sort of, you're loose-lipped, as I am at the moment, Ollie, very loose-lipped, especially for you. So where were we? So the Queen goes and does Princess Elizabeth goes and does her service, which is what I was going to quickly talk about. You can read all about this, obviously, in the Jubilee edition of Army Girls, just in case Ollie forgets to steer you in that direction. That's the Jubilee edition of Army Girls. I'm sure Ollie will help work out how we can get you a signed copy. Actually, there's a really good publisher that's got some signed copies, signed also by Barbara, who always reminds me that she's older than the Queen and not to be confused with the Queen. Fox Lane Books, they're called. You should follow them on Twitter, Fox Lane Books. They're a virtual bookshop. and they do signed copies and stuff.
I will provide a link in the show notes for anyone who would like a signed copy.
Thank you. Would you do that? They're paperback signed by me and Barbara. Barbara and I. Me doesn't sign a book. I do. So the Queen, as Elizabeth, goes down, and as you'll discover in the exclusive Jubilee content, that she's a curious conundrum even at that stage in her life. So she's 18, rising 19, at the very tail end of the war. And Gwen, who I spoke to, bless Gwen, she's wonderful, age 98. In fact, she's in that Radio 4 documentary. She vividly remembers the princess. And two things stood out. One was the princess's kind of reticence, not necessarily reticence, but a kind of almost an absence of knowledge about how to handle herself around her peers. You know, she really had been cloistered in an ivory tower. And her governess says that, Crawford says that in her Little Princess's memoir, that she didn't go to school. And then war comes, so she has even less exposure to ordinary folk, whatever that might mean, and even to extraordinary folk. Her parents are away, wandering around bomb sites and doing their bit. She's trussed up with this eccentric aristocrat, Althea, and Margaret and Crawford, and somebody comes in and teaches them how to draw pictures, and somebody pops in and teaches her about the Constitution. But that's been about it. And
French. She learned French.
She learned French. Yeah, she was good at French. She was fluent at French. Yes, she was. Better than Philip, who, of course, spent quite a few years in Paris when he was exiled as a prince. Anyway, back to Elizabeth. And she also learned to paint, and she had the odd dance for the Grenadier Guard. But generally, her life had been very rarefied. I mean, it was the gilded cage in war. I know they sort of drew a line on the bath and tried to follow rations and stuff, but really it was a pretty privileged existence in this extraordinary fortification during the war. It was ringed by anti-aircraft guns, Windsor Castle at the time, and all the sort of blackout blinds and all the art was taken down. Queen Mary thought it was a hell of a place in the war. But so she goes down, and she's shy. She doesn't quite know how to sort of be, I think it would be fair to say, partly because she's aware of her exceptionalism. Early on, we know that she knows she's in line for the throne from the age of 10. And partly, I would presume, because the likes of Gwen, are also a bit not starstruck, but aware that, hey, this is a princess. Although Gwen said we only curtsied to her when the cameras were around. And the other thing that she was very struck by was the princess's how self-possessed she was around the press. So while the girls knew how to, all the girls in the ATS, knew each other and were hanging out, and the Queen found that a bit difficult, or the princess did. When the press comes, of course, Elizabeth immediately knows what to do. She sort of goes into a set role. She does her choreography photographs. She handles them very well. Whereas for all the girls, the ATS girls, a lot of sort of giggling and sort of, tittering and practicing curtsies when the King and Queen arrive, because of course the press call come when the royal family come to visit Elizabeth, looking under the lid of a Bedford truck. So I thought those were quite interesting insights into the early years of Elizabeth. I also think that there's a huge part of her identity was formed in the war. She fell in love with Philip. She was absolutely potty about him from a very early age. I was very struck by that, again, in the memoirs and diaries. But that's very classic kind of, girl back in Britain falling in love with, military hero. It's absolute textbook. I mean, I've written a lot about war veterans, and I don't think I've met very many who didn't have a sweetheart of some sort somewhere. Most of them survived, but some didn't. Luckily, Philip did. And also that handmaiden role that she had. But people like to sort of, I think, project onto the Queen all sorts of ideas. I wish she were feminist. Was she this? I don't believe she was. She was a monarchist. That's what, first and foremost, she believed in the monarchy because her father had sacrificed a lot to become king in the wake of his brother's abdication. And if that meant she was a working mother, so be it, because the greater cause was being a monarchist. But I don't believe she was a sort of progressive. In fact, I know she wasn't a progressive liberal. I think she was rueful about the fact that she had a sort of bigger role than Philip. I think that was always one of the conundrums of her marriage. And anyway, what I was trying to say was, so that the ATS, while these girls did serve, obviously it was a non-combat role, and in keeping, really, those gender rules weren't really broken up. So girls, they signed up and they served and they wore uniform, and some even went overseas. But actually, there was no real effort to smash up and rearrange the architecture of gender. That went very much back to how it had been before the war. And we know the 1950s was, in terms of women's lib, quite a regressive decade.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to reading about your next book about the Princess Elizabeth. And
you're going to have to wait. You're only going to get a copy if you buy a copy.
It won't be that long, though, will it?
You're not going to get a free copy, Ollie. I'm not giving you a free copy this time. All he gets, just to let you know, dear listener, all he gets all these free books. He gets free books that he recycles as presents for his friends.
that my family members do all have Army Girls.
Do they? Well, they need to buy another copy. Sales have dropped off a bit.
But I was going to say that the one thing I noticed that struck me, and obviously I'm not the only one, is that the Duke of Edinburgh dying a year ago, the Queen has followed not long after. That's quite.
Yeah, I think.
Is that because you work with a lot of women in extreme old age? Is that the soulmate has gone? Is that something that? No?
I think they were both so deep into old age that they were always going to follow one quite quickly on the heels of the other. You don't live much beyond 96. There ain't many years left, even if you're, she was never on course, I don't believe, to go over 100. She's had 4 children. That weakens you. Most of the really, really old women I know don't have 4 children. Most of them are childless, actually, interestingly. There's been no research done in the extreme elderly and the impact of childbirth in the mid-20th century. But the Queen, her own mother lived, I think, to 101. And I think that I would have been amazed if even before Philip died, I didn't think the Queen would make it to 100. There was a sort of a fragility to her that sort of set in a couple of years ago. I mean, I'm finely tuned to it. I have a lot of extremely old women, like one at the moment is on end of life. Daphne rallied and made a recovery, but Joyce, one of my Century girls, is on end of life. And I went to visit her in May and I thought, not long. I thought, this sounds awful, like sort of voyeuristic kind of guessing game of death, but you do get a sense. And also I have to divvy up where I place my energies. If I have, say, about 30 women, 95 plus, who to invest time in, you want to make sure they don't slip away and you haven't not visited them, or so I do try and, to an extent, make sure that I've checked in before their great departure. I love 2 of my very dear favourites, Bletchley girl Pamela, who actually features in my Elizabeth and Philip book because she knew Philip's all-time girlfriend, Ulsa Benning, later Heineke, can't remember her surname, but anyway, they worked at Bletchley Park together. A very pretty girl. Anyway, Pamela died at 103 last year, and I remember Army Girls was just coming out, and I was devoted to Pamela, like she was a proper friend, and I knew she was dying, and I thought, I've got to get to her. I was so bombed out with 17 veterans attached to Army Girls, and Pamela is a totally another kind of separate relationship and separate book. And I did get to her. I went to see her weeks before she died, and I was really, really glad I had, because she was still compos mentis. Ditto Anne. Anne was a Century girl. And can you put in the show notes all my books, please? Anne was a Century girl, and she's my ultimate matriarch, and she died. And again, I got to see her because I'd been blocked from seeing her because she was in a home, and she went in just before COVID, and I went to see her again at the end of last year. 107 years old, still knew who I was. 107. Ditto Olive, and I didn't get to go to her funeral because I had COVID. God damn it. So it was all this last 2 years. I tell you what, none of these women, I think a couple of them were weakened by COVID. None of them died of COVID. I think the late Queen was weakened by COVID, to be honest. But none of them died of COVID. But so many of them, unlike the Queen, and that was the Queen's great privilege, really, so many of them died alone or trapped in homes. Nobody asked them if that's how they wanted to spend the end of their life. But they're used to hudding on. There is Prince William, I think, said something very interesting in his statement yesterday. It's a 240-word statement, something about having how the Queen set an example of duty and service from a different age, but which has been useful for him and our generation. And I thought it was well put. Certainly, I complained on behalf of the women about lockdown and stuff, but they wouldn't have complained. It's just something else they had to put up with in a very long life of putting up. Because and that generation of women did put up in a way that my generation don't. I'm Doctor, by the way. You introduced me as Tessa.
Well,
this woman has a title, Doctor. See, a generation before Joyce, who was a doctor and is now an honorary fellow of Newnham College, she would never correct you, aged 103.
Well, Dr. Tessa Dunlop, thank you very much for giving me your time.
Thank you very much for listening. And God save the King. Oh, I went on an American podcast, and it was I didn't realize what it was. I had no idea. My American friend went, "My God, that's massive. That's like a showbiz thing." And I was like, well, I just said yes to it. I said, how much? And then I said, oh, all right then. And I went on this American show, TMZ or something, with these 2 kind of cool guys. And they started having a go at the Queen and asking about all this trolling that's been happening. I was totally unaware. I've been blinded by our own right-wing press. I was under the impression we all loved the Queen this week at least. And apparently, people were saying she was an colonial figure, and colonialism and racism, and making all sorts of. And I suddenly, because often when I'm in the right wing press, I sort of push back a bit and say, we need to give compassionate but critical analysis. And suddenly, I found myself kind of feeling a sense. It's a bit like you can bash your sibling up, but nobody else can. That's exactly how I felt about talking about the royal family in America. I was suddenly like, no, she's not the Queen. The Queen adored the Commonwealth. She, I was absolutely suddenly became, sort of frothing at the mouth royalist.
Well,
and then at the very end, I went, God save the king, just to sort of throw.
That's wonderful, because I'm amazed at how much America is covering this, which I think does say something in itself.
Loads of countries my Italian neighbours are like, my God, it's all over Italian telly. We have the telly on all the time. I keep getting calls from Romanian media. Will you talk about Prince Philip? I'm struggling to speak in English at the moment, dear Romanian broadcasters, let alone in Romanian. Anyway, that's a different party trick. Lots of love, Ollie. I look forward to this podcast going out, and I hope the sound quality is better this time.
Yeah, well done. You've done a good job there. Coming up on Saturday's pod, I'll be returning to the history. I've got Giles Milton on Smyrna, 1922. You may not be aware, but we're at the 100th anniversary of this terrible event when Greek refugees were burnt out of the city of Smyrna, now Izmir, by Turkish forces. Many thousands were killed, and it was a humanitarian disaster. Also still to come, I have Robert Harris on his new novel, Ben McIntyre on Colditz, and Max Hastings on the Cuban Missile Crisis, as well as plenty of others. I've got Tudor history and some medieval history coming up too. So please do join me and subscribe if you can. Thank you, and good night.